And that kind of is a segue into what I can talk about in terms of what some of our challenges are. Congressman is spot on with the debt situation, and I'm not going to talk about it other than to say it's an enormous problem for this country generally. $14 trillion is an almost incomprehensible number in terms of what each of us has to pay off, and our ability to pay it off in terms of trying to do anything other than cut the amount of money the federal government spends is non-existent. It can't be done by raising taxes. It has to be done by cutting a lot of the fat out of the government. And Congressman, thank you very much for touching on that subject. I'm sorry, go ahead.
What happens to your company with this healthcare bill?
Well, we've already seen it. We've already seen the effects of the healthcare bill start to raise our healthcare costs. Now, what is going to actually happen when it's fully implemented? I don't have a very good answer to that because it's as you can see.
We had to pass it before we could see what was in it.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, right.
It's so enormously complex that the true market effects of what it's actually going to do to the cost and delivery of healthcare are difficult to tell. What I can tell you is we've seen our healthcare costs go up substantially so far, and there's nothing happening right now that looks like that's going to change in the near future. One item I am going to touch on, I was going to talk about some sort of complicated and technical issues that I'm sure would have probably put most of the room to sleep. So I'm going to talk about one very simple concept that we hear about but we don't really have a discussion about, and that's taxation. Specifically how the job creators in this country are taxed and dealt with. When we talk about how businesses are taxed, we tend to think of all businesses as sort of one big amorphous body. And we don't really take the time to think about big business and small business and what the cost of taxation is to each of them. We're a small business. We're a growing business, but we're still a small business. Our effective tax rate is 43%. That's federal, state, and local taxation. I can tell you without any hesitation right now, if our taxes were lower, we would be pouring more money into our expansion. We would absolutely be doing it. We've gotten to the point that we are growing as fast as we can, but profitability, the reason that you have a business, has suffered a lot. And if we had a lower tax rate, if we had more cash available to us, it would be going right back into business. With tax rates being what they are, we have to be slower. We have to be much more reserved in terms of how we think about investing in the company. And it's a big detractor to growth. We're not GE. We don't have a 3% tax rate. We can't shelter money overseas and do a lot of things to sort of offset our income with various credits. We just can't do it. We don't have the ability. We're not Google. We don't get money back from the federal government, despite the fact that we have billions of dollars in annual earnings. Not we. Google has billions of dollars in annual earnings. So it's probably not right. It's definitely not right to think about all businesses one big blob, and we're all doing the same things, and we all benefit or suffer based on the same circumstances. It's not true. We have a very high tax rate as a small business, and we pay absolutely every single dollar of it. The consequence of having this sort of oppressive corporate tax structure in this country is that companies are leaving. It's a very large company. If anyone's involved in the manufacturing world, their name is Eaton Corporation, Eaton Cranes. It used to be headquartered out of Cleveland up until, as far as I'm aware, today. They're moving their entire headquarters to Ireland because they estimate it's going to save them $160 million a year in corporate taxes. Why are they doing that? Because Ireland has an 11% corporate tax rate versus we have a 35% corporate tax rate. It's very simple in terms of doing the math and looking at the savings to move. There's very little real incentive to invest in this country for any business that thinks they're going to be a successful one. All the incentive is to go elsewhere. We're not big enough to be thinking about along those lines, and we honestly don't want to think along those lines because we've got enough to do with what we're doing right now in terms of trying to grow our business. But in terms of the overall incentives in this country to invest here, to grow businesses here, our tax policy is a big one. And it's really difficult, I know, Congressman, to make the case that corporate taxes should be lower when everyone looks at the big bad world of high finance and big business is the reason we got into the recession in the first place. But the reality is that investment is going overseas. It simply is. It's simply going overseas. And unless we modify what we're doing, reduce corporate tax rates, and treat small businesses like we treat big businesses in terms of making it easier for them to pay a lower effective tax rate, it's going to continue to be that way. And unfortunately, we're going to see businesses flee from this country and seek lower tax countries. And that's simply the facts.
Yeah, Jeff, you bring up a very good point, and tax reform is one of the things that we began to do in the 2011 budget that was passed and sent to the Senate. That sits stacked up there like cordwood. We began the process of tax reform, lowering the overall tax rate for everybody, closing some of the loopholes that you're talking about, so that everybody pays their fair share. Because I believe that that's something that should happen. But we've got the most onerous corporate tax structure in the world. We're the only, with Japan having recently changed theirs, we are now the only country that has the kind of corporate tax structure that we have. We've got trillions of dollars sitting overseas right now, like Jeff said, that's being sheltered there, being protected there because they won't bring it back to America and invest it here because they're going to pay 35 cents on every dollar that they have. That's a real problem for America. And tax reform is definitely something that has got to take place so that we can get a fair, flatter, simpler tax code. At the turn of the century, our tax code was about 300 pages long. Today it's 65,000 plus pages long. And you got to have a PhD to understand it. You got to pay someone to do your taxes because nobody can understand how it works. It's a sad situation. I don't want to interrupt, Jeff. You got some more? Sit up here and answer questions for these folks.
Sure. If anyone has questions, please feel free to ask. I was pretty much wrapped up.
Oh, but yeah, you know, you was talking about GE not paying any taxes. How many pages do you think their tax form was that they turned in? It was around 75,000 pages.
Yeah, I absolutely believe
Now,
it.
can you afford to pay someone that kind of money?
No.
Just to do your taxes? That's a bunch of crap.
No.
You know, the tax sheet should be 1 or 2 pages for anyone.
So what has happened over the years, this goes back to a concept that we talked a little bit about earlier, is that over the years, the federal government has picked winners and losers through the tax code. They help this group at the expense of this group, and then the next cycle they help this group at the expense of this group, to the point that we've got such a convoluted tax code at this point that to help anybody hurts somebody. And that's why it's going to be so very difficult. I actually co-sponsored a bill called Eliminate the Federal Tax Code, because I believe the only way to do this is to start with a blank sheet of paper and move the ball forward that way. Somebody had a question. This gentleman here had a question too.
Jeff, in regard to the growth of your company, aside from the tax, what restriction the taxes create, I'd be interested to know what kind of impact all of the regulatory increases since 2008, 2009 have had on the growth of the company, and whether you see any continued decline in that regard, or whether it's going to change.
Sure. Thankfully, we're dirty in terms of our day-to-day operations. But environmentally speaking, we're pretty good business. We don't put off a lot of waste streams. We do have some emissions that we have to get permits for, and so we don't have a whole lot of exposure to the types of activities that the federal government likes to regulate, I guess I could say. We do have a permit that's sort of a roll-together state and federal emissions permit that has taken forever to actually get given to us, and we're still in the process of trying to get it issued. But If we were a bigger business, I'm sure I'd be able to talk more about it. Unfortunately, like I said, we are still relatively small, and the exposure that we have to dealing with the federal government in terms of very large regulatory issues is thankfully relatively limited.
How dependent upon your business are you on steel or the availability of steel?